It was my birthday, but the only thing that mattered to him was his friends. The room was full, but somehow I felt completely invisible. The smell of bacon drifted through the house, but I hadn't cooked it. Laughter echoed from the living room. I tightened my robe, heart light with hope. Maybe he remembered. 62 today. Not a milestone, but still. Something. I stepped into the hallway, waiting, just for a second. Maybe, just maybe, he'd see me and remember. But nothing. I stood there, voice caught in my throat. As Alex retold some college story with his friends, I'm curious. Where in the world are you joining us from? Drop your city or country in the comments and make sure you're subscribed for all the latest updates. It was my birthday, but the only thing that mattered to him was his friends. The room was full, but somehow I felt completely invisible. The smell of bacon drifted from the kitchen, but I hadn't cooked it. Laughter echoed from the living room. I tightened my robe, heart light, thinking maybe he remembered. It was my birthday. 62 today. Not a milestone, but still. Something. I stepped into the hallway, listening. More laughter. Male voices. Then Alex's, loud and carefree. He was entertaining his friends again. 5 of them this time, all sprawled on the couches with snacks, shoes off, beer already open. It was 9 in the morning. I waited in the doorway. Just for a second. Just in case he'd see me and remember. Nothing. I cleared my throat. Morning. A couple glanced my way. One nodded. Another was too focused on the video game. Alex didn't look up. He was retelling some college story. Something about a prank involving a canoe in the quad. They howled like it was the funniest thing ever said. I waited longer than I should have. My hands were tucked tight into the sleeves of my robe. I thought, maybe he had a plan. Maybe there was... Against my cheeks, the kind of air that reminded you were still alive. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew this. I wouldn't sit in that kitchen another year, invisible. I walked down the street without a plan, only one quiet thought looping in my mind. I refused to disappear like this. Something was about to change. I wanted to scream, but I held it in, sitting there as I felt the years of sacrifice wash over me. The sidewalk beneath my feet felt unfamiliar, though I'd walked this route hundreds of times. Past the neighbor's roses, now wilted in the summer heat. Past the rusted mailbox that still bore my married name, Reed, even though Tom had left over a decade ago. I hadn't changed it. Funny how I'd kept that name like it meant something, like it tied me to a life that no longer existed. I ended up at the little park near the school where Alex used to play. The swings creaked gently in the breeze. I sat down on the nearest bench, the metal cool against the back of my thighs. A group of kids chased each other on the grass, their shouts echoing through the empty space inside me. I didn't cry. Not here. Not in front of the birds and the strangers and the ghosts. Instead, I sat with the weight of it, the kind that doesn't scream but settles in your bones. I wanted to yell, to throw something, to demand that someone see me, just once. But I didn't. I swallowed it, like I always did. Memories rolled in, uninvited and sharp. The year I was accepted into that interior design program in Chicago. Alex was 4. I'd gotten the acceptance letter and held it in trembling hands, barely able to breathe. But then he got sick. Some nasty virus that kept him in and out of the ER for weeks. I tore up the letter without telling a soul. I never applied again. The day I was offered the manager role at the bookstore, the first time someone actually saw my potential, I wouldn't do this anymore. I wouldn't be the backdrop to his life. I turned away from the house, not with sadness, but with certainty. I would no longer let his neglect define me. Something in me had finally woken up, and it wasn't going back to sleep. Enough was enough. I was going to take back control of my life, even if it meant breaking the bond we'd had. The kettle screamed just as I shut the door behind me. I hadn't even realized I'd filled it earlier. The sound pierced the quiet like a warning, but I let it boil over before turning the burner off. The house was empty now. Alex and his friends had gone out. Probably brunch, or beers, or whatever boys in their 30s still called catching up. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, listening to the tick of the old clock above the stove. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt familiar anymore. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was loud. It forced me to hear things I'd buried for years. I sat down at the table with a mug I didn't want and stared at the wall. Not through it, at it, like it might crack open and give me an answer. What would it look like? really look like if I stopped waiting for things to change and made the change myself? What if I stopped asking for a seat at a table I built? The thought came out of nowhere, and it didn't leave. What would it look like if I simply left? Not in anger, not slamming doors or throwing accusations, just a quiet, firm no more. I closed my eyes and imagined it. Me in a little apartment filled with soft lamps and yellow flowers and no piles of sneakers by the door. A calendar filled with museum trips and pottery classes and dinner with friends. Not his friends, not his schedule. Mine. I imagined waking up and making breakfast without someone asking if there were eggs or why the oat milk had run out. I imagined music playing that I liked, Joni Mitchell. I looked at the house, then the yard, and the idea came to me. What if I didn't need to depend on him anymore? The suitcase waited by the door like a question mark. I passed it again as I stepped outside into the late afternoon light, hoping the quiet would help me think. I wasn't ready to go to my sister's yet. I wasn't running, I was reclaiming. But where was I supposed to reclaim to? The air smelled of cut grass and summer fatigue. I wandered to the edge of the driveway, drawn by a sudden silence from next door. The estate had been empty for over a year now. Ivy crept around the porch posts like lazy fingers. The shutters hung crooked, one nearly falling off. But the bones of it, the lines, the frame, the wraparound porch, it was beautiful. A little tired but full of potential. Like me. That's when it hit me. What if I didn't have to go anywhere? What if my fresh start was right next door? The thought struck like lightning. My chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with an electric, unfamiliar hope. I stepped closer, crossing over the edge of the unkempt yard. Dandelions had taken over, their seeds dancing in the air like tiny parachutes. I cupped one in my hand, made a wish I didn't speak, and blew it away. I imagined the porch repainted, wind chimes hanging near the swing, the front windows thrown open, sheer curtains fluttering in a breeze. A little chalkboard sign by the steps. Open for poetry readings Thursday nights. Something wild and cozy and entirely mine. I stood there for minutes just seeing it. It wasn't just a house. It was freedom. It was a life I could shape without apology. Back inside, I dug through a drawer for the realtor's number. I'd seen the listing months ago, but never thought twice about it. It had seemed too big, too much, too lonely. Now it looked like salvation. The phone rang twice before a cheery voice answered. I asked if the pro, but that moment didn't last long. He found the documents first. I should have known he would. They'd been in the side drawer beside the spare batteries and old phone chargers, now slightly ajar. When I walked into the kitchen that evening, he was standing there, papers in hand, disbelief carved deep into his face. You bought the house, he said, voice flat, as if he couldn't quite believe his own mouth. I opened the fridge, calm on the outside. Yes. Are you kidding me? His voice rose like a match flaring to life. You bought that place without even talking to me? I shut the fridge slowly. It wasn't yours to approve. You live with me, he snapped. What, you just wake up one day and decide to play landlord? I didn't decide anything on a whim, I said, forcing the steadiness back into my tone. I've been thinking about this for a long time. I doubt that, he scoffed. You can't afford it. You don't even have a plan. I do have a plan, I said, and I can afford it. I use money Dad left me. It's not much, but it's enough for a down payment and some renovations. He looked at me like I was speaking in tongues. You use Dad's money for this? That's supposed to be for emergencies. I am the emergency, Alex, I said, finally meeting his eyes. The silence cracked between us, sharp and thick. Just then, Lily walked in, makeup flawless, phone in hand. She glanced between us and frowned. What's going on? She bought the house next door, Alex said, motioning to the papers, without telling anyone. Lily raised an eyebrow. Seriously? That place is falling apart. I know what it looks like now, I said, but I see what it could be. Do you know how reckless that is? Lily stepped closer, voice low but pointed. You're not exactly in a place to gamble, Martha. This kind of decision, it affects us too. Something in me snapped, not with anger, B. Alex had put that in writing. I sat down hard on the living room couch, letter trembling in my lap. The same couch I used to hold him on when he was 3 and afraid of thunderstorms. Now he was using the law to silence me. My phone buzzed. His name flashed across the screen. I didn't want to answer. I answered anyway. You got the letter? He said. No hello, no hesitation. I did. Good, because this has gone far enough, Mom. I said nothing. Just listen to the sound of his breathing, hard and uneven. Anger never suited him. It made him sound like someone else. "You're tearing us apart," he said. "You don't even see it, do you? You're destroying this family dynamic for what, a vanity project?" I flinched. "It's not vanity." "Then what is it? Some midlife rebellion?" "It's my life, Alex. I'm allowed to want something of my own. Not if it costs me everything," he snapped. "Do you think Lily wants to raise a family next to a rotating cast of strangers renting rooms? Do you even care how this affects us?" My chest tightened. I could feel the tide of guilt rising, like it always did. The pull to retreat, to make things easy again, to smooth over his discomfort at the expense of my own peace. "I care," I said quietly. "But I won't undo what I've built just to make you comfortable." Silence, then colder. "Then don't expect this to end quietly." He hung up. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the floor. I didn't move to pick it up. I stared at the window, the view of the overgrown yard next door barely visible through the afternoon haze. That house, the one I'd dared to dream about, suddenly felt a million miles away. I was tired, more tired than I'd felt in years. Not the kind of tired that a nap could fix, the kind that settles in your soul when you're made to choose between who you love and who you are. I thought of pulling the listing. Some looked at me like I was crazy. Others nodded like they understood. In the evenings I swept the porch, imagining the sound of laughter, of voices reading poetry, of guitar strings on a summer night. The dream was no longer an escape. It was soil. I was planting something real here. Inside, the house smelled of wood polish and paint. Every room had a purpose, none of them defined by someone else's needs. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and with every nail, every brushstroke, I felt it, the guilt I had carried like a second spine beginning to loosen. I stopped checking my phone for texts from Alex. He hadn't called, not since the letter. The silence between us was painful but clean. No more yelling, no more pleading, just absence. I missed him. Of course I did. But I was learning that missing someone and needing their permission weren't the same thing. I didn't cry about it anymore. I let the grief live next to the hope, like mismatched roommates. Some mornings the grief was louder, but more and more, the hope was beginning to speak. One afternoon, I sat on the porch steps with a lemon scone and my second cup of tea. The wind lifted the loose edges of the drop cloths inside the front room. Light danced through the trees. I wasn't just surviving, I was rebuilding. I was more than a mother. I was a woman with dirt under her nails, keys in her hand, and a future she didn't need anyone's permission to walk toward. Still, as I watched a family walk by, a father swinging a toddler in the air, the mother laughing beside them, I felt the familiar ache. I wondered what Alex would say if he saw the place now. If he'd see it for what it was, a declaration, not a betrayal. Cliffhanger. I smiled at the house, proud and quiet. But in the stillness, one question whispered louder than the rest. Could he ever forgive me for choosing myself? I never thought I'd be. I stared at her, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. "He never said anything," I whispered. "He was ashamed," she said. "But that doesn't excuse how he treated you. I told him that." Silence settled again, but it was different this time. Less cold, more aching. "I felt like I disappeared," I said finally. "Both of you. You never asked what I wanted, just assumed I'd bend, like I always had." "I know," she said, "and I'm sorry. I let his fear become mine. But I see you now, Martha, and I want us to do better." I watched her face, searching for cracks, for rehearsed lines, but she looked tired, human, maybe even honest. "I'm not changing the rent plan," I said, my voice steady, "and I won't apologize for what I've built here." "I'm not asking you to," she said. "I just hope this isn't the end." It felt like something softened between us, not healed, but loosened. As she left, she paused at the door. "He won't ask you for help, not even now." The door closed gently behind her. I stood in the quiet for a long time, thoughts colliding. My son was struggling, drowning, and I was sitting in a home he'd once dreamed of making his own. I had every right to protect what I'd made, but that didn't erase the ache. I walked to the window, watching the porch light flicker on across the yard. Everything had changed, and now I had to decide what to do with that knowledge. I turned from the window and sat at my desk, pen in hand, torn between protecting what I'd earned and reaching out to the one person who might never forgive me. I wasn't just fighting for a piece of land anymore. I was fighting for my life. It started with a Facebook post. One of Alex's friends, someone I barely remembered from his high school baseball team, shared a photo of the estate with a caption dripping in sarcasm. Some people choose legacy, some choose control. When your mom builds a... Alex started giving interviews, small podcasts, online forums. He spoke with charm, masking his bitterness in polished words. He painted me as someone who'd lost her way, whose stubbornness was hurting everyone. And just when I thought I'd found my footing, another envelope arrived. From the zoning board, a formal notice. The house's intended use was under review. Apparently someone had filed a complaint. Unpermitted commercial activity in a residential zone. I didn't need to guess who. I sat with the letter under my porch light, heart heavy but no longer broken. This wasn't about zoning. This was about control. Again. But I wasn't that woman anymore, the one who apologized for existing too loudly. I had built this space, from nothing, from ashes, from hope. And I wasn't going to give it up because my son couldn't make peace with my independence. Still, the fear crept in. If the zoning board ruled against me, I could lose the ability to rent the rooms, lose the income, lose the entire dream I'd just begun to taste. I looked at the house, lights glowing, porch swept, the air filled with the scent of fresh paint and pine. This wasn't just a building, it was a line in the sand. I stood and walked inside, zoning letter in hand, and whispered to the empty hallway, "How far am I willing to go to keep what I've claimed?" I thought I was strong enough, but this was the moment that tested everything. The hearing was set for Thursday. The zoning board would decide whether the house could legally function as a multi-tenant residence. Until then, I was in a kind of purgatory, living in the space I'd built with my own hands, while a piece of paper threatened to strip it all away. Tuesday afternoon, I found another envelope waiting for me in the mailbox. This one wasn't from the city. It was hand-delivered. My name written in thick black ink. The letters hurried. Another pause. "I'll inform them." The line went dead. I stood by the kitchen sink, the last light fading through the blinds, casting shadows that reached like fingers across the floor. For a long time I didn't move. I just breathed. I was scared. Of course I was, but I'd lived through worse. I'd lived through empty beds and slammed doors and years of feeling like I didn't matter. This was pain I chose, the kind that comes when you stop asking permission to be whole. I turned off the kitchen light and walked to the front room. My sketchbook waited on the table. I opened to a fresh page. I didn't know what would come next. If the board ruled against me, I'd lose more than walls and windows. I'd lose a piece of the identity I'd finally begun to reclaim. But I also knew something else. No matter what they ruled, I wouldn't go back. Not to silence, not to shadow. I picked up my pen and began to draw, not for anyone else, not for approval, but to remind myself of who I was before the world tried to tame me. This was no longer about the estate. It was about me. The ruling came quietly. A single sheet of paper slid into my mailbox, folded over once and stamped with the city seal. No courtroom drama, no drawn-out speech, just a letter. The board had approved the zoning variance. With restrictions, yes, but it was a win. I could rent the rooms, continue my work. The estate would stand as more than a home. It would be what I envisioned all along, a space for women to begin again. I stood in the center of the hallway, light pouring in from the skylight above, the letter pressed to my chest. For the first time in months, I let my knees buckle, and I sat right there on the floor, laughing, then crying, then both. Freedom isn't loud. It's not fireworks or grand speeches. Sometimes it's a quiet breath in a quiet room, and I had earned every inch of it. The tea, not every day, but some. There were nights when I'd find myself staring at the lamp by the window, wondering what he might say if he could see this version of me, whether he'd still think I was selfish, or whether he'd finally understand. Maybe Lily had shown him the text, the photo. Maybe he'd read the articles again with new eyes. I didn't know. I only knew what came next. That morning the air was still, heavy with the promise of rain. I had just come in from watering the garden when I saw it. A single email, subject, Mom. The body was short, just one sentence. Can we talk? Just the two of us? No threats, no legal language, no manipulation, just a request. My hand hovered over the keyboard. My heart thudded, not with fear, but with the gravity of old wounds stirring. He wanted to talk, and I didn't know if I was ready. I stared at the blinking cursor, torn between the peace I'd found and the past that might come rushing back with a single reply. "I'm not going back," I said aloud as I looked at my new life. I didn't reply right away. I let the email sit for a day, then two. I watched it like someone watching the sea for signs of a storm. Every time I opened my inbox, there it was, just one line, quiet and pulsing with unspoken things. Can we talk? Just the two of us? On the third morning, I wrote back, yes, Friday at 2, my house, 1 hour. That was all I gave him. My terms. Friday came with a hesitant sun and the smell of honeysuckle drifting through the kitchen window. I wiped down the table, even though it was already clean. I boiled water for tea. I wasn't sure he'd drink. And when the clock struck 2, I opened the door before he had a chance to knock. Alex stood there, hands jammed into his pockets, looking older than the last time I saw him. Not tired, worn. Like a man carrying too many things he didn't know how to put down. Hi, I hope you do. We sipped in silence. Outside, the wind shifted. Somewhere down the road, a chime rang. I'd like to come by sometimes, he said. If that's okay, not to stay, just to visit. Maybe, I said, if you come as my son, not my judge. He smiled. It was small, unsure, but it was real. I miss you, he whispered. I miss who we could be, I replied. He nodded. When he left, he hugged me, not tight, but carefully, as if the old wounds were still tender, which they were. I watched him walk down the steps and out into the street. I didn't cry. I didn't collapse. I just breathed. Later, I sat on the porch, sketchbook in my lap. The sun dipped low, staining the sky with orange and lavender. I had survived the storm, but something inside me still stirred, because even after the apologies, after the quiet return, one question still pulsed beneath it all. Was this the beginning of healing, or just a new way to keep me small? Let's start over, Daniel said. But I was no longer the woman I was before. He called it a fresh start. Daniel arrived on a Wednesday morning, unannounced but not unwelcome. He stood on my porch with a bakery box in one hand and a thin binder in the other. Cinnamon rolls, he said, and something else I want to show you. I raised an eyebrow. You know I don't eat sugar, he smiled. They're for the tenants. Smart move. I let him in, and we sat in the sunroom. The estate had grown into something I barely recognized. Quiet laughter down the hall, music drifting from the garden, a tenant's bike propped against the porch railing. A house no longer haunted, but humming. He handed me the binder. Inside, charts, projections, a business plan. I want you to consider something, he said. I'm launching a new platform, consulting, investment support for women-led startups. It's small for now, but it's clean, and I want you to be... And I didn't need a partner to define what success looked like. Still, the thought lingered. Could this be a step forward, or a gentle detour back to everything I'd fought to leave behind? I reached for the binder, heart steady, breath deep, ready to read, but not yet ready to decide. I've never felt more at peace, I thought, as I looked around at everything I'd built. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting soft light through the stained glass window in the front hall. It had been a gift from a former tenant, a design of wildflowers and open sky. I stood there barefoot, tea in hand, and watched the colors shift across the hardwood floor like slow-moving brushstrokes. I didn't open the binder, not that day, or the day after. Instead, I kept building. The estate was thriving, every room filled, not just with people, but with purpose. Women came and went with stories heavier than their luggage, some bruised, some just lost, but each one left standing a little taller. I didn't fix them. I didn't try to. I gave them space, a safe place to begin again. I knew how precious that was. Daniel came by occasionally, not often, just enough. He respected the house, the energy of it. Sometimes we talked business, sometimes just sat in the garden and listened to the wind pass through the lavender. It wasn't reconciliation, not in the way people think. It was recognition, of change, of boundaries, of respect. I didn't need his approval, but it meant something to know he saw me now, as I was. I began hosting monthly salons, nights filled with poetry, soft jazz, and stories told without shame. Women from the neighborhood came, some brought friends. A few brought silence and left with something lighter. I'd sit on the porch afterward, watching the last candles burn out and think, this is what I was meant to do. I wasn't just painting again, I was teaching a local commune. Someone was trying to bake bread from scratch again. I made a mental note to warn them about the temperamental oven. The estate no longer felt like a project. It felt like home, and not just for me, for the women who found their way here, each with a past heavy enough to break a back, but not a spirit. Their stories wove through the walls now, not as ghosts, but as roots. We were no longer just healing, we were blooming. I walked the gravel path toward the garden shed, passing a chalkboard that listed the week's activities: storytelling circle, a pottery demo, a jazz night in the back barn. All dreamed up by the women who lived here. This was no longer just my house, it was ours. Inside the shed, I found the box where I kept business cards and brochures. The new one rested on top, fresh from the printer. Pale blue with gold foil lettering, The Reed Collective, a retreat for women who begin again, founder-director Martha Reed. I ran my finger along the edge. I'd said yes to the Women's Resilience Collective in New York, not to move, but to model. They'd help fund a second location. One of my tenants, a quiet woman named Joy who used to flinch when the phone rang, had offered to lead it. She wasn't quiet anymore. I smiled to myself and stepped back into the light. Daniel's car was in the driveway. He was in the back, helping string lights for the next open house. He still didn't live here. He never asked to. But he showed up when it mattered, with tools, with time, with questions that started with, "How can I help?" instead of, "Why didn't you?" We'd come to a kind of peace, not perfect, not polished, but honest. That afternoon, I stood before a small group of community leaders in the barn, presenting the vision for the next phase: vocational training, microloans for women leaving shelters, weekend mentorships for teenage girls. Every word I spoke felt like it.